He sits down with celebrity chef Tyler Mater, the grandson of the owner of one of Milwaukee's most iconic restaurants. Plus, you won't believe what Wisconsin's Department of Public Instruction is instructing. But first, I'm joined by Silvio Canto Jr. Hi, Silvio. How are you?
How you doing? Thank you very much.
Your book, Cubanos in Wisconsin, tells the tale of your family's struggle to leave communist Cuba in the early 1960s and come to Wisconsin. How did you end up here from there?
Well, that's a great question. We were living in Cuba. This was in 1963, and my uncle had left the country already, my dad's brother. And he was in Miami for about a year, and then he was relocated to Wisconsin by a church. So he wrote us a letter in 1963, middle of 63, I think, saying that the church would be interested in relocating us if we were interested. And my dad said, of course, it's better to at least know where we're going. But then the next question was, where's Wisconsin? And we had no clue where it was, no idea. My father, who was pretty well educated and knowledgeable, knew nothing about it, except that it was a place where we would find freedom. Oh, my dad did know about the Milwaukee Braves.
That kind of translates all borders, doesn't it?
So he knew about the Milwaukee Braves. But he really didn't know anything about Wisconsin. But it didn't really matter because Wisconsin, for us, at that point became synonymous with freedom. And that's why we were so excited that we could go somewhere where we knew we could live and settle down, and even a place we didn't know anything about.
Well, we all, have Wisconsin synonymous with beer and brats and the Green Bay Packers and winters that seem to last forever. But it's interesting that you and your family, after the journey that you had escaping totalitarian rule, really started to keep it synonymous with a new life, a better opportunity.
Absolutely, and it still is. Even though I don't live there anymore, after college, I ended up in Dallas, Texas, and that's where I am now. But when we get together, my parents still live here, and my parents still have ornaments from Wisconsin in their home. There's something very special about Wisconsin in our family. It means so much to us because if you understood where we were back then and what a great Wisconsin was, this just great place where we were going to go. And it turned out to be a great experience. The people of Wisconsin were just absolutely wonderful.
The book is called Cubanos in Wisconsin. You can buy it at cubanosinwisconsin.com. My guest, Silvio Canto Jr., joining me here on Conversations. What was it like, Silvio, growing up after the Revolution?
Well, at first, it wasn't much of a change. At first. But by 59, and especially into 60, the radical change was very obvious. And I think my parents became very disillusioned. They supported the change, but became very disillusioned. And as I'm sure some of the people in the audience who are history majors remember, that Cuba became a huge topic in the 1960 debates between then Vice President Nixon and Senator Kennedy. And Cuba became a huge topic because the radicalization of Cuba was very quick, to the surprise of my parents, who never saw that coming.
What came?
Well, what came was the first thing that happens is your freedoms begin to disappear. For example, newspapers, radio stations are taken over by the government. That's the first thing that happened. The Catholic school that I went to, which was a private school, but a Catholic school that I went to, was shut down. And the priests and nuns were sent out of the country.
Why was that?
Well, because they fear religion. That's one of the things. It's interesting. If you interview people from other communist countries, you'll find that communist governments are very much afraid of religion because it's difficult to control what happens inside the church. So they became very concerned about religion, and so they shut down the schools. They also began to take away freedoms in ways. In the book, for example, I talk about something called the Committee for the Defense of the Revolution. And these are committees that were literally groups that were formed in every block, and the purpose of these groups was to spy on other people.
Man.
They would spy on you, and little things like, for example, you were buying food outside of the rationing that the system had created, because that was another thing that happened. They began to ration food, and what you could own and what you could buy.
It sounds so foreign to us here in America, who almost take for granted the liberty and the absence of real government oppression that we have here. It seems so foreign to think that this is happening, 90 miles off of the coast of Florida?
That's right, and it was foreign, believe me, to a lot of Cubans too, because this was a real radical change. And in the book, there's a scene, for example, where my parents are almost like looking at each other, saying, "What's happened to our country?" Yeah, I mean, it just begins to overwhelm you to the point where you've got two choices. You either become a part of the revolution, or if you're opposed to the revolution, if you're lucky enough to get out, then that's my story. But then you have others, of course, who ended up in prison and who've been executed. That's the other sad part.
So what was the final straw that finally made your parents say, we have to get out, we have to start a new life in America?
Well, I think the final straw for them was probably the missile crisis, because before the missile crisis, just to put this in perspective, the April 61, you have the Bay of Pigs, and the missile crisis was October 62. And I think that up to the missile crisis, my parents had hoped, and a lot of Cubans really, had hoped that there would be a change. But after the missile crisis, you began to have the consolidation of the communist government, because it is true that the missiles were removed, but the Castro was not removed. So that basically allowed Castro to get more and more access to the Soviet Union. Cuba then became truly a Soviet satellite, and then all of a sudden it was a totally different country, and my parents simply said, this is not where we want our kids to grow up. We want our kids to grow up in freedom. And, I'm so grateful for that, because I talk to people who've grown up in Cuba, and it's like talking to a person from another planet, and I say that respectfully, not in a mocking way.
Sure.
I mean, it's like, they cannot talk about things like Saturday Night Fever or Animal House or stuff like that. I'm not talking about material things like an automobile. I'm just talking about the things that I did growing up, being able to grow up as I did in Milwaukee and listen to the radio or whatever. They didn't have those experiences like I did, and it really makes you appreciate freedom more than anything else.
That is really interesting. And as you came to America, how did your worldview change? Even as, a child, a young man, how did you really become an American, a Cuban American?
Well, the first thing that happens when you come to the United States, like in our case, is that, especially in Wisconsin, we didn't really have a lot of Cuban options. I mean, so I had to integrate myself rather quickly, because the only time that I was talking about Cuba, or even in Spanish, is when I was at home. So, I had to get out there and learn about this new country that had welcomed us. But the thing that we had was two parents who kept telling us about freedom. My parents would always at the dinner table talk about, hey, these freedoms we have, don't take them for granted. And my mother would often read letters that we get from Cuba at dinner time, and it was a way of reminding everybody what we had gone through. But the thing that I love most about the United States is the Bill of Rights, because when I look at the Bill of Rights, I see Cuba, or what we lost in Cuba. The first one, of course, freedom of speech, the right to have a gun, or bear arms. That's one of the first things they do in a communist country. They shut down the newspapers and take your guns away. The speedy trial, the right to a speedy trial, the right to privacy of documents, and so on. One of the things that Castro did is he put my dad's cousin in jail for 15 years without a trial. So when I read the Bill of Rights about a speedy trial and privacy of papers and stuff like that, that means a lot to me. So due process is something that means a lot to me, maybe more than an American. A lot of Americans, as you said initially, take this stuff for granted. Well, don't take it for granted, because it can disappear. As I've said many times, my parents would have never believed in 1960 that this was all going to disappear.
When you see the federal government talk about getting guns off the streets and taking guns away and, little by little chipping away at that Second Amendment, what do you as a Cuban American see?
Well, the first thing I see is a practical response. It doesn't really work. I mean, if gun control worked, Chicago would be a paradise. And you know that Chicago is not too far from you, and that's a killing field. And again, I say that in a sad way. But But I think any time government talks about taking away your freedoms, you have to hit the brakes and say, why do you want to do this? Because when they start with something, a lot of the other stuff continues. And that's what really happened in Cuba. I think people who are familiar with the Cuban story know how quickly one thing can lead to the other. And when the government has the guns and the populace doesn't, they can have control over you that I don't think a lot of Americans understand. So I'm very concerned about any encroachment on our rights. And the Second Amendment just happens to be the one right now. But there's other stuff, too, about, for example, the mandates on health care and the mandates on religion. That's also very important. Your religious freedom is also a very important part of the Bill of Rights.
So what you're saying is that it's not paranoid to be leery of tiny government encroachments, as the media tends to say that they might be, because they can actually lead to a more totalitarian stance.
Absolutely, and talk to anybody who has lived in a communist country. I mean, it's interesting. I have a friend from Romania, and we're about the same age, and she grew up in Romania. She's often a guest on my radio show, and she's written a book about her experiences, and it's amazing how similar what happened in Cuba is what happened in Romania. I mean, all the communist countries had these committees for the defense of the revolution. All of the communist countries had one newspaper. In Cuba, there's one newspaper, and that is the voice of the state-run media, as they like to say. Mm-hmm. That is, in fact, what they have in Cuba. There's one newspaper in Cuba. Now, there are some. The newspaper has certain sections, like a sports section and stuff like that, but it's basically one newspaper delivering a message that the government wants you to deliver. And I find it interesting, going back to my example of running into people who grew up in Cuba. There are people in Cuba who don't know things that happened around the world. For example, a lot of Cubans didn't know that the Soviet Union had invaded Czechoslovakia because it was never reported in Cuba. Because, again, the only way they could find out about it was if they were lucky enough to get the Voice of America or the BBC on short wave. Now, in Cuba, you do have the advantage that some radio stations, AM stations, come in because of the proximity. So, yes, a little bit, some of them could get it that way. But it's just amazing what the government will do against your rights if you're not careful. So I'm very, very, if you want to call me paranoid, but I'm very sensitive about losing my rights.
I think you're not paranoid, you're sensible. You've lived this before. You know what can potentially come of it. He is Silvio Canto Jr., the book Cubanos in Wisconsin. You can buy it at cubanosinwisconsin.com. Silvio, thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure. Have a great day.
So is Wisconsin